Today is the 5th anniversary of my marriage to Kieffer Tyson. At 8 o'clock in the evening, I obediently put on the makeup and dress of the young mistress of the Tyson family and went downstairs, where Kieffer was already waiting. He was leaning against the car, idly spinning his phone, and upon hearing footsteps, he lifted his eyelids, his gaze lingering on me, but he said nothing. It had been a while since I last saw him. "Let's go," I said calmly. At the entrance of the banquet, I naturally took Kieffer's arm, seemingly not expecting my peaceful demeanor. He glanced at me. I looked at the entrance of the banquet, raising the most standard smile. As the leading couple, we should enter hand in hand. Kieffer suddenly grasped my hand. Interlocking our fingers, I slowly raised my head, meeting his deep, dark eyes. "Kieffer, everyone is waiting for us." This 5th anniversary was being celebrated more grandly than ever by the Tyson family. I held Kieffer's arm, gracefully exchanging pleasantries with each guest, always poised and impeccable. The cake cart was slowly pushed into the venue, and this year, Kieffer's gift to me was a simple violin. I could tell at a glance. This violin was extraordinary, definitely a sought-after masterpiece. So Kieffer still remembered my childhood dream. I stroked the strings and said, "I haven't played the violin for a long time. I'm afraid I will let down such a precious instrument." Kieffer looked at me meaningfully, his voice low. "It's never too late." "Too late," I answered in my heart, my expression unchanged. I took the gift box from the staff and handed it to Kieffer. "This year's gift, I personally picked it. Not just the gift, but I also chose the gift box myself, even thoughtfully tying a big red bow on it, very festive." Kieffer lowered his eyes and looked at it for a few seconds, seemingly moved and wanted to open it on the spot. I stood on tiptoe, hooking my arms around his neck and embracing him. Just like every anniversary, I smiled and whispered in his ear, "I suggest you don't open it now." Kieffer's body stiffened. My breath brushed past his ear. "Mr. Tyson, I'm done acting." Kieffer's other hand, hanging by his side, suddenly gripped my waist. I smiled relievedly. "Kieffer, I can finally get rid of you." The banquet continued, but Kieffer was nowhere to be found. I calmly left the scene. We got married on this day, and we will divorce on this day. 5 years, complete and entire. My assistant Phoebe was driving, frequently glancing in the rearview mirror. Mr. Tyson's car is chasing us from behind. I didn't even have the desire to look back, ignore him. Just as I stepped inside the door, I heard the roar of a sports car behind me. Kieffer grabbed my wrist from behind. The grip was strong, pressing painfully against my bones. I didn't struggle, enduring it. Kieffer's tone lost its casualness. "Were you serious? Are you asking about what I said or the divorce papers?" I faced away from Kieffer, answering truthfully to myself, "Both are serious." The grip on my wrist slowly loosened. Kieffer withdrew his hand. The air fell into a suffocating silence. Kieffer suddenly sneered, "Martha Foster, what right do you have to ask for a divorce?" I turned my head to look at him, ultimately saying nothing. If he said I had no right, then I had no right. The room was dark. Only a thin, cold moonlight streaming in through the side window. Kieffer stood there straight, the moonlight on the floor silently crushed under his feet. "Martha, you married me because of a forced union, because you needed to atone, but never because of me, right? All these years, you've been obedient and never resisted. And now that the debt is paid off, you want to kick me away?" He laughed lowly, as if hearing a joke. I blinked, also feeling like laughing. Kieffer's smile faded, and he began to tear the divorce papers in his hand. Bit by bit, I let him tear them, not stopping him. Perhaps my silence further angered him. Kieffer suddenly raised his hand, and the torn pieces of paper fluttered down over my head, their thin edges causing a slight sting on my face. I stood still, enduring his wrath. Kieffer's lips curled into a cold smile. "Martha, don't even think about it. He kicked the door open violently, making a loud noise, and left in a huff. I didn't care about him. Slowly walking upstairs. In the study, I was organizing the photo album my mother left behind, when a photo suddenly fell out. I picked it up and looked at it, feeling a bit lost. The photo was taken when I was 5 years old. I was wearing a white princess dress, my eyes curved into crescents as I smiled. Standing on either side of me were 2 little boys. They looked like they were cut from the same mold. But one had a gentle, reserved smile as he looked at the camera, while the other looked cool and reluctant. One was Theo Tyson, and the other was Kieffer Tyson. Ding! This novel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. I held the photo for a long time, thinking about Kieffer's words, and in a daze, I glimpsed the cruel claws of fate. Since I could remember, Kieffer never liked me. My grandfather and old Mr. Tyson were comrades in arms. It is said that if it weren't for my grandfather, old Mr. Tyson would have been buried in a foreign land long ago. Thus, the friendship between the Foster and Tyson families was as solid as a rock. When I was a child, old Mr. Tyson and my grandfather discussed arranging a marriage for their children. Theo Tyson and Kieffer Tyson were a pair of twins, and they found it hard to choose. Old Mr. Tyson teased me, "Sweetie, which brother do you like? Pick one, and Grandpa will give him to you." I was bewildered, looking at the 2 identical young masters, feeling very conflicted. After a long while, I kissed Kieffer on the cheek. His face turned red to the roots of his ears, and he angrily wiped the spot where I kissed him. "You little rascal." I felt very wronged, pointing to his face. "Brother, does it still hurt?" Yes, I kissed him because there was a scratch on his face. Whenever I got hurt, the adults would kiss my wound, saying it would make it stop hurting. Imitating them, I kissed Kieffer. But Kieffer was ungrateful. "None of your business." And then he fiercely warned me, "Don't call me brother." I cried and threw myself into my mother's arms, while the adults laughed heartily. The engagement was thus set. As they put it, we seemed like destined little foes. The old saying goes, foes are bound to meet, and we were the best match. But reality proved they were only half right. Kieffer and I were indeed foes, but not a good match. Kieffer was the leader among children, always causing trouble with a group of kids. He always teased me. He would roll in the mud and then throw mud at my princess dress. I pouted, about to cry, and he laughed uproariously. Covered in dirt, the little Kieffer's appearance was unrecognizable, but his grin revealed incomplete teeth. Theo Tyson was completely different from him. He was afraid I'd cry, and would comfort me softly, taking me home to change clothes. In kindergarten, I always had candies in my pocket. I shared them with Theo, and he beamed with joy. When I offered them to Kieffer, he snorted disdainfully, "I don't want them." In elementary school, I lazily copied Theo's homework, and Kieffer mercilessly reported me to the teacher. I was punished to stand, and as he passed by, he laughed gleefully, "Serves you right." In middle school, I stood by the playground and shouted, "Go, Theo!" Under the scorching sun, Kieffer ran past, drenched in sweat. He glared at me fiercely, "Martha, shut up, you're so noisy." Frightened, I swallowed back the "Go, Kieffer." I was about to shout. In high school, as teenagers began to develop crushes, a girl asked me to deliver a love letter to Kieffer. I was quite troubled. I didn't know when it started, but I realized that when someone gave Kieffer a love letter, I felt very unhappy. Moreover, since childhood, the adults always told me that when I grew up, I was to marry Kieffer. So I somewhat domineeringly thought that Kieffer shouldn't accept anyone else's love letters. Seeing this, Theo kindly helped me refuse. "Kieffer is engaged to Martha. It's not appropriate to help you." From then on, the news that Kieffer belonged to Martha spread throughout the school. Kieffer was extremely dissatisfied, scratching his thick eyebrows irritably. "Martha, you're really something." Since that day, once someone started sending me love letters, Kieffer would throw them into the trash can in front of everyone as a form of revenge. No one dared to send me love letters anymore. In his words, "If my romantic prospects are cut off, you can forget about yours too." After that incident, Kieffer seemed to dislike me even more. I was quite upset for a while. I asked Theo, "Does Kieffer dislike me?" Theo smiled gently, Why do you ask that? If he doesn't like me, I won't marry him in the future. I had always known that marrying someone who doesn't love you turns marriage into a grave. The other person would have their own world, while you would be trapped in that grave, living a life of utter tragedy. Just like my parents. Theo was silent for a long time before asking, "Do you really like Kieffer?" I nodded. "What do you like about him?" I couldn't answer. Young love always seems so irrational. If gentle and cultured Theo was like the silent, nourishing rain of spring, then the wild and unrestrained Kieffer was the passionate, free wind of the wilderness. I wanted to chase that fierce wind in the wilderness. Seeing that I didn't respond for a long time, Theo lowered his eyes. "Martha, he likes you too." After a pause, he added with a smile, "He's just a childish fool." Huh? I opened my eyes in confusion. If he likes me, why does he still tease me? I couldn't understand the way boys liked someone. Young Theo's gaze fell on the open book. Everyone shows their affection differently. I had always believed Theo's words without question. My young heart couldn't help but flutter. One evening at a Tyson family party, I quietly slipped away from the adults and knocked on Kieffer's window. He was naturally lazy and hated attending these parties, listening to the adults chatter. That day, he opened the window while engrossed in a heated game, not even looking up. "Don't bother me." "Kieffer, do you like me?" Kieffer's hand exaggeratedly shook, causing his phone to fall to the ground, and the game displayed "Game over." I smiled at him. "Why are you blushing?" "Martha Foster," Kieffer gritted his teeth. "Are you really a girl?" "I am." "Then you should act more reserved." I blinked. "Answer me first." Kieffer became impatient, snorting coldly, "Only a fool would like you." With a bang, he shut the window. My heart shattered. I cried my heart out under the covers. Young love and hate are always so earth-shattering. I stayed angry at Kieffer for the entire summer. When the college entrance exam results came out, Theo received an acceptance letter from the top university. I did moderately well, but thanks to extra points from my violin awards, I could attend the college I wanted. As for Kieffer, he got a beating from old Mr. Tyson. To reward Theo, old Mr. Tyson generously arranged a car to take a group of us childhood friends to a mountain resort villa. Without supervision, we went wild. I drank wine for the first time. It tasted awful. I wrinkled my face and tears came out from the taste. Kieffer raised an eyebrow and said sarcastically, "You can't handle it, and you still try to drink." "None of your business." "I'm not interested in minding your business." Arguing with Kieffer only made me feel worse. Out of spite, I drank a lot. Unsurprisingly, I got completely drunk and fell into a deep sleep amidst the loud music and wild dancing of my friends. When the earthquake hit, I thought it was just my dizziness. Everything happened too fast, the ground shook, and the steel and concrete crumbled with loud crashes. There were screams all around, utter chaos. When Theo rushed over, I didn't even have time to react. I only saw the beam collapse, crushing the slender shoulders of the young man. I don't know how long it had been when I woke up from unconsciousness. Darkness surrounded me, with no sign of light. My whole body hurt, but I couldn't pinpoint where. I tried to move but found myself restrained. It wasn't steel or concrete, it was the slightly warm body of a young man. "Theo," I couldn't move, and tears streamed down my face. For the first time, I felt the strong presence of death. Warm, sticky liquid dripped onto my neck, and Theo's breath, shallow, brushed against the top of my head. "Martha, don't cry." Theo's voice was weak. "You're bleeding a lot." I cried even harder, afraid he would die. I could feel his pain, his body trembled uncontrollably. Yet he still smiled and comforted me. "Don't be afraid, Kieffer will come to save us." He said that when the earthquake happened, Kieffer was the only one not in the villa. He would definitely come to save us. Kieffer became the spark of hope in our despair. With that hope, we confronted death in the darkness. Theo said we couldn't fall asleep. So, we talked about many things. In the end, I couldn't remember what we talked about. I only remembered Theo's increasingly weak voice. Like soft murmurs. "In the future, live happily with Kieffer. I won't be there to pass messages anymore. Martha, I'm sorry. If you had chosen me, it would have been great. Theo didn't hold on until Kieffer came to rescue us. That day, more than half of the people buried survived, but not Theo. The rescue continued, everything around was chaotic, and I was in a daze, unable to feel pain. I vaguely heard many people talking. Kieffer's cries were especially long and heartbreaking. The young man's grief was like a landslide and tsunami. I thought, that day, Kieffer cried out all the tears of his life. In the following years, he lived wildly and never had red eyes again. I was in a coma for a long time in the hospital and missed Theo's funeral. Kieffer didn't come to see me either. I heard after being discharged that Kieffer had gone abroad. Old Mr. Tyson told me that before Kieffer left, he knelt at home for a long time. He stubbornly said, the one who should have died that day was me. I never knew why Kieffer suddenly left that night, nor did I understand why Theo apologized. In that year, the 3 people who thought they would never part were taken away by the wheels of fate. Theo stayed forever at 18. Kieffer resolutely left his homeland and didn't return for 4 years. I often felt guilty, gradually developing a sense of guilt, willingly accepting the shackles of fate, and finding bittersweet solace in the collapse of life. Right or wrong was no longer a question, redemption became a long journey of suffering. Realizing tears were falling, I wiped away the stains on the photo over and over again. I put the photo back into the album and carefully packed it into the suitcase. It seemed that the past 27 years, in the end, only turned into a thick photo album. Really, nothing was left behind. The gifts Kieffer gave me over the years. They sit quietly in the glass cabinet in the walk-in closet, shimmering with an inestimable value. The young master spends lavishly to win a smile from a beauty, casually and often, never showing much sincerity. I lean the violin against the cabinet. At a glance, only this violin holds a fraction of genuine sentiment. From the wedding room, I only took my own clothes. As the car turned the corner, Phoebe cautiously said, "Mr. Tyson seems to have returned." I looked up at the rearview mirror. Kieffer had come back. The car sped to a stop at the entrance, and he quickly entered the door. I averted my gaze. "Let's go." The next day, Kieffer's father called. He didn't waste words, "Come home immediately to see me." The call ended abruptly. I held the phone and sighed softly. The Tyson family. All the servants were dismissed from the house, leaving a pin-drop silence that was suffocating. I walked towards the study on the 2nd floor and saw Kieffer standing by the window at the end of the corridor. He was still wearing last night's clothes, with bloodstains marring his white shirt, especially glaring. His hands were wrapped in bandages, fresh blood seeping through. Despite such a miserable state, he didn't look the least bit disheveled. Smoke curled up from between his fingers, and his handsome face was filled with cold indifference after a storm. Hearing footsteps, he glanced at me briefly, then lowered his eyes, saying nothing. I silently passed by and pushed open the study door. All the elders of the Tyson family were there, and their conversation ceased the moment I entered. Following the proper etiquette, I greeted each one. With Grandma Tyson present, the scene wasn't too unpleasant. She waved me over. "Martha, come and talk to Grandma." "Why the sudden decision to divorce?" "Grandma, it's not sudden." I poured her warm tea as usual, gentle but firm. "You know, I wouldn't say this lightly. Tea doesn't cool instantly, and neither do people's hearts." The old lady understood but still asked reluctantly, "Are you really determined to divorce?" "Yes." Fearing she might worry about property division, I added, "Rest assured, I don't want anything. It's not about the money." She waved her hand. "Kieffer has been reckless these years, but you grew up together and have been married for years. I thought you two would get through the quarrels, who knew?" I found it somewhat laughable. Kieffer was indulgent, but with the status of the Tyson family's young master and unparalleled business acumen, his romantic escapades seemed insignificant. Everyone was tolerant, and he received endless favoritism. Kieffer and I were never equals. I couldn't have emotions or personal feelings, otherwise, it was all wrong. Seeing my silence, she played the emotional card. "I've watched you grow up. You've been filial, gentle, and appropriate in everything since marrying into our family. Grandma really doesn't want to let you go." I lowered my eyes, my fingers unconsciously tracing circles in my palm. "People who didn't cherish you in the past, now suddenly can't bear to part with you. Grandma, take care." I said no more. Bowing deeply to everyone, I turned to leave. The door was suddenly pushed open, and Kieffer walked in with a cold expression. He didn't look at me, but as we brushed past each other, he tightly grasped my wrist. It didn't seem painful, but he kept applying pressure. I looked down at his hand, more blood seeping out, soaking the bandages. His words were directed at the others but struck me deeply. "Don't bother, I won't divorce." Intimidated by his presence, no one spoke. The air was silent enough to hear a pin drop. Kieffer's lips curled slightly, almost a smile, but his words were chilling. "Unless I'm dead." By the end of the day, Kieffer's father was so angry that his face turned blue. He grabbed the old lady's cane and struck down hard again and again. The blows were heavy, the sound dull and sinking into the flesh. "The one who has affairs with other women is you, and now the one who doesn't want to divorce is also you. How did I end up with such a scoundrel for a son?" I suddenly remembered the day of the wedding. It was the same scene. The difference was, this time I didn't rush over to protect him with a pained heart. Instead, Kieffer turned his body slightly, as if to shield me. He pressed his lips tightly together, not uttering a single cry of pain, nor a word of surrender. I thought, Kieffer is still the same stubborn person, he hasn't changed a bit. In the end, it was Mrs. Tyson who couldn't bear it and hugged her husband tightly, pleading for mercy. Mr. Tyson, exasperated, said, "Spoiling a child is like killing a child, go ahead and spoil him then." Kieffer took me away from this farce. At the door, I pulled out my hand, my wrist stained with crimson blood. I wanted to say something, but then decided against it. We remained silent, leaving only the silence. After a long while, he laughed mockingly. "Martha, you really don't care about me now." I frowned. This guy is something else, blaming others first. Many things are long stories, and many words are meaningless. I had no intention of arguing, so I simply remained silent. Kieffer waited for a long time without hearing a sound from me, and he seemed deflated, looking much more dejected. He asked out of the blue, "Have you moved most of your things?" I nodded. "I've taken everything I need to take." Kieffer fell silent again. For a moment, I couldn't figure out what he was thinking. Knowing well that he wasn't someone who cared about money, I still said, "Besides my personal belongings, I didn't take anything else." Hearing this, Kieffer laughed again, both playfully and mockingly. "In your heart, am I this kind of person?" "Not at all," I replied calmly. "I just wanted to draw a clear line between us." Kieffer seemed to understand my thoughts. His smile gradually froze and then disappeared. "You didn't take anything at all." He turned his face to one side, his slightly curved lips looking both self-mocking and desolate. "But I feel like I have nothing left. I chose a day with good weather, bought some flowers, and went to the cemetery to visit my mother and also Theo Tyson. My mother's new grave, after several storms, had moss starting to grow on the tombstone. I thought, no matter how deep the bonds between people are, they all eventually turn into solitary graves. Some remain outside the grave, some inside. Repeating this cycle, in the end, everything fades away in the human world. Love and hate are written off in one stroke. No need to dwell, no need to obsess. After standing for a long time, I held the flowers and walked through the cemetery to visit Theo. His grave was renovated every year. 9 years had passed, yet it showed no signs of age. But the young man in the photo was forever 18. I had come countless times, speaking many words to him. The young man smiled gently, as if truly listening to my heart, but he could no longer relieve my troubles or comfort my sorrows. I kept thinking, if Theo were still alive, what kind of life would he have? He would be honored, have a happy family, children and grandchildren around him, living a fulfilling life. Such a gentle and kind person deserved as much. But the hardest thing to unravel in this world is fate. That day, Kieffer asked me why I didn't resist. What could I resist with? My guilt was hard to let go, my pain had no solution. "Theo, I'm moving forward now, will you blame me?" I asked softly. The wind blew by, the young man remained silent, with no answer. This was a long farewell. I stood up, brushed off the dust. "Theo, I'm leaving, I probably won't come back." In the end, we all have to walk our own path. Before leaving, I thought of Kieffer again and said, I'm sorry, I couldn't follow your advice and have a happy life with Kieffer. The ties were deep, but the fate was shallow. The flood of destiny had scattered us. We each boarded our own drifting boat, making it hard to reach the shore together again. I stood silently for a long time before deciding to leave. Just as I turned around, Mrs. Tyson was standing behind me. I was startled and my steps halted. She was holding pastries and walked to Theo's gravestone, placing them down one by one. I knew I would find you here. Her tone was calm, without any fluctuation, and she was speaking to me. I nodded silently. Mrs. Tyson didn't speak further, taking out a silk handkerchief to wipe Theo's photo, even though I had already wiped it clean and there was no dust. After a long pause, she finally spoke. Should I say you're foolish or that you have a conscience? I looked up as Mrs. Tyson gently caressed Theo's photo. My Theo was such a good child, he never wanted others to feel guilty because of his kindness. My heart trembled, she knew everything. I disliked you, but it was not because of Theo. She straightened up and slowly folded the silk handkerchief. Kieffer has always been wild and unrestrained. We never had a heart-to-heart conversation. I thought he was forced to marry you and was unhappy, which is why he acted recklessly. As a mother, I don't want my child to have an unhappy marriage, so I was harsh on you. I understand. I said sincerely, I never blamed you. She walked down the mountain, and I quietly followed. I didn't understand my own son. He didn't dislike you, he liked you too much. Mrs. Tyson seemed a bit remorseful. I remembered some things from my youth. It seemed everyone preferred the more outstanding child, even in a family like the Tysons. Theo and Kieffer were twins, and the family's love had to be divided between them. With love, there are biases. Theo's brilliance captured the attention of the entire family, while Kieffer's wild and unrestrained nature made him less likable, often leading to neglect. Kieffer, being naturally rebellious, became increasingly unruly and difficult to tame. After Theo's death, Kieffer seemed to find his way back, taking on all the family's expectations. Except in matters of love, where he remained reckless, it was hard to find fault with him. Old Mr. Tyson once said that Kieffer believed he should have been the one to die that day. It seemed he felt a deep guilt towards Theo. Mrs. Tyson sighed, that time I hit you, he was so angry he went to Africa to hunt wild deer to vent his frustration. Only then did I realize how foolish he was. I thought of the photos of him and Kara, and it was hard to distinguish truth from fiction. It seemed everything was a dead end. Mrs. Tyson guessed my thoughts. He wants you more than anything to let go of that baseless guilt. Maybe he even thinks you liked Theo, which is why he chose the dumbest way to keep acting out. She couldn't help but sigh. He forces you to resist and break free, while simultaneously acting like a child throwing a tantrum for not getting candy, wanting you to notice him. He keeps acting out, and in the end. At this point, this proud lady even made a request. Martha, as a woman, I know some things can't be undone. She paused, putting on her sunglasses before continuing, but as a mother, I hope you can part with him amicably. That child is stubborn. Don't let him end up in a dead end. I heard the catch in her voice, and my heart ached along with her. After she left, I walked along the mountain path for a long, long time. I thought of many things, including Theo. Theo always said, Martha, Kieffer is just a childish fool. I think he was right. Kieffer had always been like that, contradictory and proud. Excessively proud, and excessively stubborn. When I returned to the wedding room to find Kieffer, he was sitting in my walk-in closet. He was repairing everything he had broken earlier, one by one. I don't remember who told me this, but the most powerless thing in life is, when you're extremely angry, you smash things to vent, and when you calm down, you fix everything you broke, piece by piece. Kieffer looked up at me briefly, then lowered his head, silently continuing his work. The bandages on his hands were already blood-stained and filthy, yet he didn't seem to feel any pain, nor did he seem to know what he was so persistent about. I didn't say a word and went downstairs to get the first aid kit. When I came back and sat in front of him, reaching out to grab his hand, he struggled a little. Look at him, still being stubborn. Even though I was mentally prepared, my heart still skipped a beat when I unwrapped the bandages on his hands. Doesn't it hurt? Kieffer turned his face away from me, grunting, "Didn't you say you didn't care if I lived or died?" I laughed out of frustration. "Kieffer Tyson, you're being unreasonable." He heard me laugh and turned to look at me with a complex expression. In all these years, it seems we've never had a proper conversation. I carefully cleaned his wounds, smiling wistfully. From our youth to our marriage, we always seemed close yet distant, entangled yet detached. It was our personalities, it was fate playing tricks. We were like two crashed planes, on a path of destruction, beyond redemption. Kieffer remained silent, not denying it. I didn't stop my actions, speaking calmly and softly. "Kieffer, I married you out of alliance, out of debt, and out of love." Kieffer suddenly pulled his hand back, reacting strongly, clearly not believing me. "Don't move." I pulled his hand back, smiling. "Did you forget? That year in London, it was you who told me not to be greedy." With that, he fell silent. Love is hard to express, painful yet powerless. Kieffer tried to explain, but his voice choked. "I know, you say one thing but mean another." I gently wiped the fresh blood from his wound, but back then, I was truly heartbroken. Kieffer never seemed to understand one thing, that saying one thing and meaning another is one thing, but hurting others is another. "But didn't you come back and tell your father you wouldn't marry me?" Kieffer gritted his teeth, still angry. "You said it so easily, how was I supposed to feel?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Did you forget about Kara?" He really had forgotten, raising his eyebrows. I didn't take her seriously. She followed our convoy, and after I returned home, I never saw her again. That time in Africa, I don't know how she knew I was there, and later. The rest, he did on purpose. When I first met Kara in London, I thought Kieffer liked her. I was quite sad, thinking if he really had someone he liked, tying him to me would make for a miserable marriage. If he wasn't happy, I couldn't bear it either. So, I told my father I wanted to call off the engagement. I got a severe beating for it. Thinking back now, it was quite funny. I actually laughed out loud. At first, I was really sad, but later, I really didn't care anymore. The spirit in Kieffer's eyes gradually faded. My actions were gentle, my voice soft, even with a hint of a smile. "All these years, my love for you has been diminishing. Every time you did something outrageous, my love for you decreased, until it finally reached zero." Kieffer tightly grasped my hand, his lips pale. His throat was dry, unable to speak a complete sentence. I gently moved his hand away and continued to treat his wound. "You know, no matter what your reasons are, they can't erase the hurt you've caused me." Over the long years, he had repeatedly and stubbornly hurt people, pricking them. Those small details were enough to cause deep pain. I only learned to let go after countless times of red eyes and sleepless nights from heartache. "Kieffer, what does it mean to love someone?" I don't know how to answer you. Should I start from the time I knocked on your window at 17, or the nearly 100 plane tickets back and forth to London because I missed you too much during those 4 years? Or from the time you said you wanted to eat my mom's noodles, and I learned how to make them repeatedly before traveling thousands of miles just to cook a bowl for you? Or from the years when I helped you deal with scandals involving you and other women? There were too many moments, none of which could be easily summarized. I never said I loved him, but I showed it 1,000 times over. But he chose to ignore it all. Kieffer turned his head away, not daring to look at me, his fingers trembling. I smiled forgivingly. "I know, you don't want to hear it because you already know." How could Kieffer not feel my love? He just stubbornly believed that everything I did was for the title of Mrs. Tyson. Over the years, he repeatedly asked if I was tired of acting. How could I prove to him that it wasn't an act? He seemed to forget that even if I did nothing, his grandfather would still have us marry. This marriage contract was his promise to my grandfather. Now that I think about it, perhaps this marriage contract was a curse from the beginning. Kieffer and I were bound together. No matter what the other did, it seemed natural to question whether it was out of responsibility or genuine affection. Maybe I was at fault too. The shackles of the foster family, my mother's years of illness, and my debt to Theo had exhausted me. Kieffer's constant pressure made me rebellious. Love turned distant. Kieffer didn't look at me, tilting his head back, the corners of his eyes red. "Martha, believe me, I've never liked anyone else. We haven't been apart for over 20 years, and we won't be in the future either. He was so confident. Relying on our childhood bond, the supposed prison of our marriage, and my tolerance and kindness towards him. He seemed to forget that Martha Foster was a person. Her heart wasn't made of steel and concrete, it could hurt and wanted to stop beating more than once. But I'm going to let you go. I gently tied the last knot on the bandage. As I was about to get up, Kieffer suddenly reached out and hugged me, burying his head deep in my neck. Cold liquid seeped into my skin, and the sound that reached my ears was muffled and fragmented. No matter what I do, will you still leave? I softly told him, Kieffer, I want to be Martha Foster again. The world is vast, far beyond what we saw yesterday. Why be trapped in the past, weaving our own cocoons? Kieffer always wanted me to break free from the cage, but he didn't expect that when the day came, I would let go of him too. He let his hands fall weakly, his head lowered, still unwilling to let me see his eyes. Okay. His eyelashes trembled, his voice hoarse, you were always meant to be Martha Foster. I knew. This time, he wouldn't torment me anymore. On the day of the beginning of autumn, Kieffer called. We arranged to meet at the Civil Affairs Bureau. Kieffer arrived late, just as they were about to close. After not seeing him for nearly 3 months, he had changed subtly. Though his eyebrows still arched with a carefree and reckless attitude, there was a newfound silence and restraint in his narrow eyes. He lazily curled his lips, you've lost weight. This man had a sharp eye. In fact, I hadn't lost much weight, but he could tell with just a glance. The staff are about to get off work, I reminded him. You're in such a hurry? Yes. Kieffer lowered his eyes and didn't say anything more. As the staff was about to stamp the void mark on our marriage certificate, Kieffer turned sideways, half hiding behind me. He pretended to hold me in his arms but kept a proper distance without touching me. This scene felt familiar, and I couldn't help but think of the day we got our marriage certificate. At that time, we had just graduated. It was his grandfather who personally took us to get the certificate. Kieffer was reluctant and even warned me when we got into the car, Martha, think it through, don't regret it. I didn't say anything and nodded resolutely. When we took the wedding photo, I was so nervous that my palms were sweating and my expression was stiff. We took several shots, but the photographer was never satisfied. Kieffer's fingers played with the ends of my hair, so nervous? As the shutter clicked, he mischievously hugged my waist, honey, smile. I straightened up, my face instantly turning red. The photographer was very pleased, that's it, that's how a bride should look. This photo ended up on our marriage certificate. Kieffer's eyebrows were slightly raised, with a smile on his face. I leaned lightly on his shoulder, looking shy but with a sparkle in my eyes. To anyone, Kieffer didn't look coerced, and to anyone, we seemed like a loving newlywed couple. At the moment of getting the divorce certificate, Kieffer recreated that scene. His roguish smile brushed past my ear, honey. I frowned hard. The stamp hasn't been placed yet, so I'm not wrong, right? Kieffer shrugged innocently. Snap, the stamp came down. Kieffer sat up straight, took the red and green booklets, and without looking, clutched them in his hand. Outside the Civil Affairs Bureau, Kieffer sent an invitation, how about a breakup dinner? I checked my watch, there was still time. My treat. Sure, I treated you when we got married, you treat me for the divorce. I led him through a narrow alley into a small shop. Low, old wooden tables, red plastic stools. Sit down. Kieffer stood still, are you this stingy? I reminded him, on the day we got the certificate, you brought me here. I always insisted on finishing what I started. Kieffer scratched his eyebrow, seems like it. He compromised and sat down. The table was too low, and he was tall, with long legs that had nowhere to go. He could only stretch them under the table. Under the small table, his long legs were very invasive, and the hem of his suit pants brushed against my ankle. I shrank back, somewhat regretting bringing him here. The landlady greeted us warmly, it's been a while since you two came together. It's been a few years. I nodded. On the day we got the marriage certificate, Kieffer said, honey, shouldn't we have a meal to celebrate? The word honey jumped out of his lazy tone, making it hard to tell if it was real or fake. He brought me here. The landlady saw the red marriage certificate on the table and kept congratulating us. Kieffer's expression was lacking, but there was a hint of a smile in his eyes. When paying the bill, he even gave extra money. His smile was faint, consider it as wedding candy. You've been married for several years, right? Do you have kids? The landlady was overly enthusiastic. Kieffer curled his lips playfully, saying nothing. I answered truthfully, we just got divorced. Ah. The landlady was shocked, stunned for a moment. Not daring to ask further, she changed the topic, the usual? Yes. The landlady walked away, and Kieffer asked, have you been here alone before? No. I answered without thinking. Actually, I had been here. But I didn't want to admit that during that marriage, I was so humble. When Kieffer's scandals were all over the place, I was lost and didn't know where to go. I always thought of our wedding day and unconsciously formed a habit. When I felt sad, I would sit here, head down, eating the steaming noodles. Pretending the tears were just from the steam. You're lying. Kieffer's long fingers tapped lightly on the table edge. You came here often during our marriage. How do you know? Kieffer smiled faintly, not answering. I didn't press further. Not every question has an answer, and not every question needs one. Kieffer and I belonged to the latter. After leaving the small restaurant, we walked along the narrow, winding alley. Kieffer suddenly said, this place is about to be demolished. There was a hint of regret in his tone. I remembered, this place meant more to Kieffer than to me. He brought me here for the first time in high school. We ate 2 bowls of noodles, and while the landlady was busy, he left the money and walked out. A stack of red bills. Are you crazy? Leaving so much money for 2 bowls of noodles? I couldn't understand. Kieffer covered my mouth, half pulling, half carrying me away. I later learned that the landlady had a child with ALS and was always running to the hospital. So we often came, always leaving money and running away. Once, the landlady chased us for several streets with the money. I thought, I liked Kieffer not just because I yearned for freedom and wanted to chase the fierce wind, but also because, despite his wildness, he had a soft heart. You wouldn't still be thinking about the landlady returning your money, would you? Not wanting the atmosphere to be sad, I teased him on purpose. Kieffer glanced at me, looking down on me, you really think too much. We bantered all the way, bringing up each other's embarrassing moments from our youth, mercilessly mocking each other. Talking and talking, Kieffer teased, if I had known that getting divorced would make us get along so well, I would have dragged you to get the divorce certificate a long time ago. I looked down at the bluestone road under my feet, smiled, and didn't respond. At the alley entrance, Kieffer took out a wrapped violin from the car. Afraid I wouldn't take it, Kieffer smirked, I've accepted your gift, so you have no reason to refuse mine, right? Yes, not to mention the divorce agreement, he even took the divorce certificate. I reached out and took it, thank you. You're welcome. Kieffer scratched his eyebrow, I remember you said at 15 that you wanted to take your violin and conquer the international stage. You still remember. I smiled. In our youth, we were fearless, determined to make our dreams shine like the moon in the sky. Later, I realized that the world is full of shattered dreams. Kieffer looked at me, I remember everything you said. I pretended not to understand his meaning, Mr. Tyson has a good memory. Of course. Kieffer raised his eyebrows proudly. For a moment, we were back to our teenage years. Kieffer crossed his arms, silent for a long time. I saw shallow scars crisscrossing on his left hand, and on his long ring finger, he still wore his wedding ring. Noticing my gaze, Kieffer turned his hand to look. Oh, the wedding ring. I really didn't want to focus on it. But just one glance, and he caught it. Not knowing what to say, I simply stayed silent. Kieffer's eyes were focused, I promised to give you freedom, but I didn't promise not to pursue you again. Knowing it was impossible to have any result, I smiled, you can't catch me. Kieffer looked at me quietly. He was both arrogant and laid back, Martha, as long as I stand, no one dares to take my place. Yes, Kieffer indeed has reasons to be proud. Phoebe's call came in at the right moment, and I turned to answer, shifting away from the topic of Kieffer. I'm here. As the voice came through the receiver, I saw a car not far away on the roadside, flashing its hazards a few times. I see you. Putting my phone back in my bag, I turned to Kieffer. I have something to do, I need to go. Wisps of smoke blurred his outline, and he only nodded slightly. I wanted to say goodbye. But then I thought it might not be appropriate. So, I silently said in my heart, Kieffer, take care. Phoebe's car couldn't stay parked for long, so I jogged over with my violin. As the car drove away, Kieffer was still standing there. I looked away and slowly closed my eyes. That night, I boarded a plane heading far away. During the long flight, I suddenly became interested and opened my violin case. To my surprise, besides the violin, there were other things inside. A bank card and a safety charm from a Buddhist temple. There was no password on the bank card, but I could guess it, though I probably would never use it. I looked at the safety charm. It had 3 words on it, safe and happy. Flipping it to the back, there were 2 lines of small engraved characters. Martha Foster. Kieffer Tyson. I silently looked at it for a while, then put it along with the bank card into my carry-on bag. That night, high above the clouds, I had a dream. In the dream, the familiar tree-lined road was still long and quiet. The sunset filtered through the treetops, casting dappled shadows, and at the end of the road was a sea of orange trees. Young Theo was carrying his backpack properly, while young Kieffer slung his backpack over one shoulder carelessly. I ran towards their backs. Wait for me. Theo turned around, smiling gently. Martha, slow down, I'll wait for you. Kieffer didn't even turn his head. When I finally caught up to him, he frowned disdainfully. Why are you running so fast, rushing to reincarnate? I complained to Theo, he's bullying me again. Don't bother with that childish fool. I made a face at Kieffer triumphantly. Kieffer frowned even more. Martha, are you an idiot? He reached out to tug at my braid, and I ran off, with him chasing me hard from behind. Theo lagged far behind, watching us and laughing. It turns out that even youthful friendships eventually cannot bloom together. This journey is long and far. No more days of reunion. So, Kieffer, don't frown. Don't worry. Everything will eventually pass. Extra chapter. Actually, Kieffer knew it. That day at the alley entrance was the last time he would see Martha. She would never come back. Kieffer abandoned his car and walked alone on the long street at night. He thought of many things. When he was very young, adults pointed at a pretty little girl and teased him, "That's your future wife." From childhood to adulthood, his and Martha's names were always linked together, a fate set early on. He also knew from an early age that he liked Martha. That kind of liking was recognized by everyone, open and aboveboard, and blessed by all. Childhood sweethearts, innocent companionship, happiness, and fulfillment. This was the life he wanted to give Martha. But how did they end up where they are now? Kieffer thought it might have been the trip after the college entrance exams, when Martha got drunk and Theo cautiously kissed her cheek. Or maybe it was after Theo passed away, when he was sorting through Theo's belongings and saw Theo's diary, filled with his silent affection to Martha. Kieffer would regret for the rest of his life that he left in a fit of anger that night. If he hadn't left, it would have been him buried in the ruins with Martha. It would have been him who died, not Theo. And Martha wouldn't have to feel indebted to Theo all the time. Kieffer thought that Martha's sense of indebtedness might also be mixed with feelings, making it unbearably heavy. When he was young, Kieffer sometimes heard adults joking. They said, "Look, Martha and Theo's personalities are more compatible." They regretted, yes, it would have been better if Martha had chosen Theo back then. In Kieffer's heart, a wound had formed and scarred over. He just thought, the living can never compete with the dead. Especially since this person was his brother. Kieffer always had an obsession. His Martha should be that proud yet slightly spoiled, bright and charming girl when she smiled. She was also the genius violinist who shone all over while holding her violin on stage. He so wanted to take her away from the prison of fate, but didn't know how to start. Kieffer naively used the most direct and shallow way. Feigning debauchery and clumsily moving through fleeting romances, to test her, to press her step by step. Testing if she had any real feelings for him, forcing her to abandon the shackles of fate, to let go of her thoughts and guilt towards Theo. The person involved was confused, and the onlookers dared not speak. He walked further and further down this absurd path. It seemed to be working. Martha was truly free, and she had truly let go of him too. The long street was silent at night, and Kieffer found his eyes a bit sore. When the wind blew, tears were about to fall. He walked for a long, long time, as if he wanted to walk through his entire life. He knew Martha wouldn't come back. He couldn't find her anymore. Kieffer finally remembered that. During those 4 years in London, Martha came to see him once. The girl who had never done anything outrageous wore a miniskirt and sat on his motorcycle. He deliberately scared her. "You better not. If you fall off and die, it won't be pretty at all." She was most afraid of being ugly. But that day, the girl stubbornly held his waist. "It's not a big deal to die with you." Kieffer just thought, "This girl is so strange. She could die with him. But she didn't want to be with him."